I never thought a set of car keys could hold so much weight. It was early spring, the kind of day in Ohio when the air is still cold enough to bite your cheeks, but the sun teases you with the promise of warmth. I stood outside the dealership, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my worn leather jacket. My palms were sweating, not from the weather but from the thought of what I was about to do. I'd been saving for 3 years. Not in a big, dramatic way, no lottery wins or sudden inheritances. Just the quiet discipline of a man who's been working with his hands all his life. Fixing small engines at the shop, helping neighbors repair their lawn mowers, shoveling snow in the winter. I didn't need much for myself anymore. My knees ached on cold mornings, my back complained after long days, but the idea of giving my son something that could make his life easier that kept me going. Ethan, my boy, though at 28 boy might be a stretch, had been catching the bus to his office job downtown. I knew it wasn't easy. Buses in our part of the city didn't run like clockwork. Sometimes he'd be late to work through no fault of his own. Sometimes he'd have to stand out in the rain, his nice dress shoes soaking through. I didn't want him living like that, not when I could do something about it. That's why I was here, about to buy him his first real car, a silver sedan. Nothing too flashy but solid, dependable, just like I'd always tried to be for him. The salesman handed me the keys, the metal warm from his hand. "Congratulations," he said. "She's a beauty." I nodded, but my mind wasn't on the shine of the paint or the smell of the new leather. I was thinking about the moment I'd hand these keys to Ethan. I imagined the surprise in his eyes, the way his shoulders might drop with relief, knowing one of his daily struggles was over. When I pulled into his driveway, Melissa came to the door first. My daughter-in-law always carried herself like she was stepping into a photo, hair just right, lipstick perfect, even on a Tuesday afternoon. She smiled, but it was the polite kind, like she was answering a phone call she hadn't wanted to take. "John," she said, "what's all this?" I stepped out of the car, holding up the keys. "Where's Ethan?" He appeared behind her, wiping his hands on a dish towel. His eyes widened. "Dad, whose car is this?" "It's yours," I said, grinning. No more waiting for the bus, no more rushing in the rain. For a moment he just stared at me, and I could see the kid he used to be. The one who'd race to the driveway when I came home, the one whose face lit up at every surprise. He hugged me, and for a second it felt like we'd gone back in time. "Dad, this is incredible," he said. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," I interrupted. "You've been working hard, you deserve it." Melissa's smile widened, but I noticed her eyes flick to the interior. "It's beautiful," she said. "We'll have to be careful to keep it in perfect condition." That was the first time I heard it, her voice wrapping around the word perfect like it was something fragile, too precious to touch. We spent the afternoon going over the features, syncing Ethan's phone to the Bluetooth, setting his seat position. I insisted he take me for a spin, just around the block. He drove with the kind of carefulness you see in someone carrying a tray of champagne glasses, every turn smooth, every stop deliberate. Melissa sat in the back, running her hand over the leather seats like she was memorizing their texture. When we parked back in their driveway, Ethan handed me the keys again. "You should drive it, Dad," he said. I laughed. "I just bought it for you. It's your turn to enjoy it." Melissa tilted her head. "Maybe another time," she said lightly. "We'll want to keep the mileage low." It was a small comment, maybe nothing, but it planted something in me, a seed I didn't recognize yet. That night back in my small apartment, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, thinking about the day. I should have felt nothing but pride, but there was an itch I couldn't scratch. I'd given them something from my heart, but there'd been a strange distance, as if the car wasn't a bridge between us but a wall. Still, I brushed it off. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was reading too much into it. After all, I wasn't doing this for gratitude or attention. I was doing it because I loved my son. And maybe, if you're watching this right now, you've done something similar. You've given a piece of yourself, only to feel it slip from your hands in ways you didn't expect. If you've ever been there, you know the quiet ache that follows. Before we go any further, I'll just say, stories like this aren't easy to tell. But if you're willing to walk this road with me, hit that like button, subscribe, and stick around until the end. Not for me, but for the reminder that love, respect, and dignity are worth talking about. Because this story, it doesn't end with the car. It begins there. The first few weeks after giving Ethan the car were nice. Better than nice, actually. They were filled with the kind of small, everyday moments that make a father feel useful again. On Tuesday mornings, I'd see him pull up outside my apartment building, that silver sedan gleaming under the weak Ohio sun. "Need a ride, Dad?" He'd call out from the window, smiling. And I'd climb in, the warmth of the heater wrapping around me like a blanket against the March chill. Those drives weren't long, maybe 15 minutes to the grocery store or 20 to the doctor's office, but they gave us time together. I'd ask about his job, and he'd tell me about his coworkers, the projects piling up on his desk. Sometimes Melissa would come along, scrolling through her phone in the passenger seat, chiming in with the occasional comment about traffic or how late the bus used to make Ethan. I took her politeness at face value, not looking for anything more. One Saturday, Ethan suggested we take a drive to the farmer's market downtown. It had been years since I'd gone. As we rolled through the city streets, I couldn't help but notice how carefully he drove. Hands at 10 and 2, speedometer never more than 2 miles over the limit. I taught him to drive in my old pickup, a truck that rattled if you went too fast and groaned if you turned too sharp. Back then, he'd laughed his way through every lesson, taking wide corners just to make me grip the door handle. Now there was no laughter. He was precise, deliberate, like the car was some fragile artifact in a museum. At the market, Melissa insisted on parking far away from other cars. Fewer chances for someone to ding the doors, she explained. I didn't argue. I figured it was just her way of taking care of something valuable. But as the weeks passed, I started to notice little things. The back seat was always spotless, the floor mats perfectly aligned. If I reached for the glove compartment, Melissa's eyes would follow my hand like a hawk tracking prey. Once, I slid in with a cup of coffee and she immediately handed me a travel napkin, saying, "Just in case, John, we don't want spills." I told myself it was fine. It wasn't my car anymore. I'd given it to them, and they had the right to take care of it however they wanted. Then came the first odd moment. It was a rainy Friday evening, and I'd just finished a long day at the shop. My knees were screaming, and I was soaked from head to toe because the bus stop offered about as much shelter as an open umbrella in a hurricane. I called Ethan, thinking maybe he could swing by and give me a lift home. He'd done it before. "Sure, Dad," he said. "But can you hang on a bit? Melissa's running an errand and she has the car." So I waited. 40 minutes later, the silver sedan pulled up, windshield wipers clicking. Melissa was driving. Ethan was in the passenger seat. I reached for the door handle, but Melissa rolled the window down instead. "Hey, John," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sorry we're a bit late." "It's fine," I said, opening the back door. She hesitated. "Oh, do you mind just holding your bag on your lap? We had the seats cleaned and they're still a little delicate." I froze for half a second, then climbed in, bag on my knees. We drove the rest of the way in near silence, except for Ethan telling me about a new project at work. It wasn't the request itself that bothered me, it was the tone. Like I was a guest in a space I'd once owned. Like I needed to prove I could be careful enough to belong there. 2 weeks later, I had another doctor's appointment. This time, I didn't want to bother Ethan, so I took the bus. But as luck would have it, the line was delayed and I was running late. I decided to call anyway. "Of course, Dad," he said. "I'll swing by." 10 minutes later, the sedan pulled up again, Ethan driving this time. I got in relieved. The heater was on, soft music playing. And then I noticed Melissa's small leather bag sitting neatly on the seat between us like a silent reminder, this space is not yours. Halfway to the clinic, Ethan asked if I'd mind stopping by the dry cleaners to pick something up for Melissa. I said sure, but inside, I felt that same itch from the day I'd given him the keys. The itch of knowing I didn't quite fit into the picture. That night, I sat in my recliner staring at the muted TV. Maybe this was just how things went. You raise your kids, you give them what you can, and eventually you become an accessory to their lives, something they bring out when convenient, store away when not. But I kept remembering the way Ethan had hugged me that day, the way his eyes had lit up, and I wondered how long it would be before that light dimmed completely. By summer, the car had become part of their identity, Ethan and Melissa's identity, not ours. I say ours because in my heart I still felt connected to it. I couldn't help it. I'd been there the day it rolled off the lot, felt the steering wheel in my hands, smelled the leather before it ever left the dealership. But now, it was as if the car and I belonged to two different worlds. Ethan still called every week, but the calls were shorter, more like polite check-ins than real conversations. Work's good, Melissa's busy, we're going to a friend's wedding next weekend. That kind of thing. I'd ask if they wanted to come over for dinner, and more often than not, Melissa wasn't feeling up to it or they already had plans. Once, I suggested we all go on a Sunday drive together, just me, Ethan, and Melissa. I thought we could head out to the lake, have a picnic like we used to. Ethan paused for a long time on the phone before saying, "We'll see, Dad. Melissa's been keeping the weekends open for errands." It was a small answer, but it landed heavy. When we did see each other, it was usually because I'd called asking for help. Like the time my neighbor needed to get her elderly mother to the hospital and the ambulance was tied up. I phoned Ethan, figuring maybe Melissa could drive while he sat with the patient. Ethan said they couldn't. Melissa had just gotten the car detailed and they didn't want to risk any stains or smells. I laughed politely, but when I hung up, the silence in my apartment felt sharper than usual. The truth was, I didn't just miss the car. I missed being part of their daily lives. When I gave Ethan those keys, I imagined the gift would bring us closer. That we'd share more moments, road trips, late-night drives, maybe even helping each other out when life got messy. Instead, the car had become a barrier, a shiny, four-wheeled wall that separated us. And I started to notice something else. When I was around, Melissa's guard went up. She'd straighten the already straight seat belts, adjust the spotless cup holders, glance at the floor mats like she expected dirt to materialize under my shoes. It was subtle, but I could feel it, like a draft in a room that no one else notices. One Thursday evening, I saw them drive past my street. I was standing outside, watering the small patch of grass I still called a yard. I waved, but the car didn't slow down. For a moment, I wondered if they'd even seen me. Then I realized Melissa was driving, Ethan looking down at his phone. My wave hung in the air, unanswered. That night I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. I tried to list the times I'd been in the car since giving it to them. In 4 months I'd counted 6 rides. 6. For something that had cost me nearly all my savings, that was a hard number to look at. I also started noticing how my calls were answered differently. If Ethan picked up, things were easy. But if Melissa answered, there was a tightness in her voice, like she was bracing for a request. "Oh, hi, John, Ethan's busy right now. Did you need something?" Need something. As if my only role in their life was to ask for favors. The invisible distance grew thicker. And the strangest part, I found myself hesitating to call at all. I checked the bus schedule 3 times before thinking about asking for a ride. I'd rather wait in the rain than hear that pause on the phone, the one that told me I was an inconvenience. I knew something was changing between us. I just didn't know yet how far it would go. But I was about to find out. It was one of those Ohio mornings where the rain doesn't just fall, it seeps into your shoes, your coat, your bones. The kind of morning that makes you want to crawl back under the blankets and pretend the world can wait. But the world wasn't waiting for me. I had a job that morning. A customer who'd booked weeks in advance to have his old snowblower serviced before winter came back around. He was a good man, paid in cash, never argued over the bill. And with my pension barely covering the basics, I couldn't afford to lose the job. I checked the bus schedule while sipping my coffee. First bus, canceled. Second bus, delayed. The third wouldn't come for another hour, and that was too late. I paced the small kitchen, the clock ticking louder with every lap. That's when I thought of Ethan. It had been a while since I'd asked him for anything. I didn't want to be that father, the one always needing a ride or a handout. But this was different. This was important. And after all, hadn't I bought that car so he'd have the freedom I never had? Maybe, just maybe, he could share a bit of that freedom with me today. I dialed his number. He picked up on the third ring. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" "Morning, son," I said, trying to sound casual. "Listen, I'm in a bit of a bind. My buses are all messed up and I've got a customer waiting. Any chance you could lend me the car for an hour, just to get to the shop and back?" There was a pause. I heard voices in the background, Melissa's among them, a muffled conversation. Then Ethan came back on. Melissa's saying it's not a good time, Dad. She just had the car cleaned yesterday. The seats are still, delicate from the treatment." I thought I'd misheard him. "The seats are delicate." Another pause. "Yeah, and it's raining pretty hard. We just don't want to track anything in right now." For a moment, the only sound in my kitchen was the rain tapping against the window. My hand tightened around the phone. I felt something hot crawl up my neck, not just anger, but a kind of disbelief. I'd raised this boy to be generous, to put people above things, and here we were talking about delicate seats while I stood there needing help. "I see," I said finally. My voice came out quieter than I meant it to. "I'm sorry, Dad," Ethan added quickly. "Maybe you can call a cab. A cab at $40 one way, for a job that barely paid more than that." "Sure," I said, forcing a chuckle. "Don't worry about it. I'll figure something out." We hung up and I stood there for a long time, the phone still in my hand. The rain outside blurred the world into gray shapes. My reflection in the kitchen window looked older than I remembered. In the end, I called my neighbor, Pete, who still had his old pickup. He drove me to the shop, water leaking through the cracked passenger window the whole way. I thanked him, paid him in cash, and told him I owed him one. But the thing I couldn't shake wasn't the wet ride or the near-missed appointment. It was the sound of Ethan's voice when he said no. Not uncertain, not apologetic, just settled, as if the decision had already been made long before I'd called. That night I didn't bother making dinner. I sat in my recliner with a can of soup, staring at the muted television. The car, the one I'd worked years to buy, was probably sitting spotless in their driveway, while I'd been scrambling for a ride in the rain. And here's the thing about moments like that. They don't just sting. They start to reframe everything that came before. Suddenly, I was replaying every ride, every polite smile, every time Melissa handed me a napkin before I sat down. I'd thought those were quirks. Now they felt like warnings I hadn't paid attention to. I'd given them a gift, but somewhere along the way, that gift had turned into a cage. Not for them, for me. I wasn't part of their lives. I was part of their terms and conditions. And I didn't like the fine print anymore. Some memories are like warm photographs. You take them out, hold them up to the light, and they still glow the way they did when they were made. Others, well, others turn sour. The colors fade, the edges curl, and you can't look at them without feeling a sting. The day I handed Ethan the car keys had been one of those glowing memories. At least it used to be. I could still see it, clear as if it had happened yesterday. The way his eyes widened when I pulled into his driveway, the disbelief that melted into joy, the hug that felt like it bridged the gap of every argument, every missed birthday dinner, every silent stretch between us. Even Melissa had smiled that day, her hand resting on the roof of the car like it was a new member of the family. I'd thought I was giving them more than just transportation. I thought I was giving them freedom, a little bit of breathing room in a world that never stops pressing in. I thought I was giving us more shared moments. But the sound of Ethan's voice in the rain that morning, the way he told me no because of delicate seats, had cracked that memory right down the middle. It's strange how quickly the mind works once it's been cut. Suddenly, I was revisiting every interaction since that day and seeing it through a different lens. The careful way Melissa adjusted the seatbelts when I got out. The extra floor mat she'd once slipped under my shoes. The time Ethan had offered me a ride but insisted on a towel over the passenger seat because he just had it detailed. I'd brushed all those things off before. Now they stacked on top of each other until they formed something heavy. And in that weight I felt something else, a hollowness where my pride used to be. When you're a father, you get used to giving. Your time, your energy, your money. You don't keep a ledger. You don't expect repayment, but you do expect a kind of respect, a mutual understanding that what you've given came from a place of love. That morning in the rain, I realized that love wasn't being respected, not in the way I needed it to be. The next few days, I tried to shake it off. I told myself maybe they were just busy, maybe Melissa had been having a bad morning. I tried to bury myself in work at the shop, but even there, little reminders crept in. I'd see a customer hand his son a wrench and watch the kid's face light up. I'd hear Pete talking about how his daughter had surprised him with dinner after work. And then there was me standing in the cold, thinking about how my own son wouldn't let me sit in the car I'd bought him. On Friday night, I dug into the top drawer of my desk. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just shuffling through old papers the way you do when you can't sleep. That's when I saw it, the manila envelope from the dealership. Inside was every piece of paperwork from the day I'd bought the car. The sales agreement, the warranty, the title. The title. I sat back in my chair, the paper in my hands feeling heavier than it should have. My name was right there in black ink, as clear as the day it had been printed. John Miller, owner. A thought slipped in quiet, almost apologetic at first. It's still yours. I pushed it away. That wasn't why I'd kept the title in my name. It had been a formality, a way to make the process smoother if I ever needed to handle repairs or insurance questions. But now, with the memory of that refusal still burning in me, the title didn't feel like a formality. It felt like leverage. I closed the envelope and slid it back into the drawer, but the thought didn't leave. It sat there in the back of my mind, patient, waiting for me to look it in the eye. That weekend, I didn't hear from Ethan, not even a text. By Sunday night, I knew I wasn't going to, so I went for a walk, letting the cool night air clear my head. I passed by their street, half hoping I might see them, but the house was dark. The silver sedan sat in the driveway, gleaming under the streetlight, untouched by rain, untouched by me. I stood there longer than I should have, the sound of my own breathing louder than the crickets. And I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. That car wasn't connecting us. It was a wall between us. And I was the one who'd built it. The manila envelope didn't stay in the drawer for long. By Tuesday morning, I'd pulled it out again. It sat on my kitchen table next to my half-finished cup of coffee like it was daring me to open it. I'd been telling myself I was overreacting, that the sting from that rainy morning would fade, but the truth was, it hadn't. If anything, it had sharpened. I slid the title out, smoothing the paper against the table. There it was, in all its plain, bureaucratic glory. John Miller, owner. Not co-owner, not transfer pending. No, it was mine, legally, completely. I traced my finger over the letters of my name, remembering the day I'd signed them. At the dealership, the salesman had asked if I wanted the car put in Ethan's name right away. I'd said no, only because it was easier to handle the financing in mine. I'd planned to transfer it later once everything was squared away, but I never did. Maybe some part of me had wanted to keep that last thread of control. Maybe it was just habit, years of putting my name on every big purchase, every mortgage, every insurance form. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. The silver sedan sitting in Ethan's driveway still belonged to me. I leaned back in my chair, the creak of the wood loud in my small kitchen. The thought came again, stronger this time. You could take it back. And just like that, the door opened in my mind. A door I hadn't realized I'd been standing in front of for weeks. But taking it back wasn't just about the car. It was about what had been taken from me. My dignity, my place in my own son's life, the respect that should have come with a gift like that. I'd spent my whole life believing that giving was the highest form of love, and maybe it was, but giving without respect, that was just surrender. I thought about the years I'd worked to save that money. The winter mornings when I'd trudged to the shop before dawn, the summers when I'd fixed engines in a stifling garage, sweat running into my eyes. I'd skipped vacations, ignored the small luxuries, new clothes, a better TV, so I could give Ethan something he needed. And in return, I'd been treated like a risk to the very thing I'd sacrificed for. That morning, I decided I wasn't going to sit on my hands anymore. I made a list, something I'd always done when a problem seemed too big to tackle. Step 1. Confirm ownership. Step 2. Research the process for selling a vehicle that was still in my name. Step 3. Decide what to do with the money. It felt good, solid, like I'd finally stopped treading water. I called a friend from the VFW hall, a guy named Carl who'd sold his old truck last year. He walked me through the basics, where to sign on the title, how to notify the DMV, the best way to get a fair appraisal without tipping off a buyer too soon. "You sure you want to do this?" Carl asked. "It's a big move." "I'm sure," I said. My voice didn't even shake. Next, I called the dealership where I'd bought the sedan. I asked for the same salesman, Mark, who'd sold it to me. He remembered me. Small town Ohio has its perks that way. When I explained that I was thinking about selling, he said, "Bring it in any time, John. We can give you an appraisal on the spot." That part would be tricky, of course. The car was in Ethan's driveway, but I knew their routines. Melissa left for work around 8, Ethan around 8:30. If I timed it right, I could be there at 9, drive it to the dealership, and have it back before they got home. I closed the manila envelope and set it back on the table. It looked smaller somehow, like the paper inside had shed some of its weight. That night I barely slept. Not from doubt, but from planning. I could see it in my mind. The moment I'd signed the car over, the keys leaving my hand. And then the best part, what I'd do with the money. I already knew. I donate it to the local fund for single fathers, the same one that had helped me back when Ethan was a baby and I was working 2 jobs to keep the lights on. It felt poetic in a way, turning a gift that had soured into something pure again. By dawn, I'd made my decision. I was going to do it. The next morning, I stood at my window and watched the rain slide down the glass. Across town, the silver sedan was probably still parked in the same spot, waiting, just like me, not for long. Once the decision took root, it didn't let go. For weeks, I'd been circling the idea like a man pacing around a locked door, unsure if he really wanted to know what was on the other side. But now the key was in my hand and I was turning it. Still, there's a difference between deciding something in your head and committing to it in your bones. The night after I'd spoken to Mark at the dealership, I sat in my recliner with the TV off, letting the quiet fill the room. My mind kept drifting to Ethan's face. The smile the day I gave him the car, the easy way he'd hugged me. That memory still carried warmth. And yet, alongside it, the sound of his voice saying no in the rain kept looping in my mind, cold and sharp. I wasn't looking for revenge. At least, that's what I told myself. This wasn't about punishing Ethan or Melissa. It was about reclaiming something that had been twisted out of shape. The car had started as an expression of love and had turned into a symbol of distance and disrespect. I wanted to take it back, not out of spite, but to stop letting it hang over me like a cloud. I pulled the manila envelope closer, opening it again just to see my name on the title. That name felt heavier now. Ownership wasn't just a legal term. It was a reminder that I still had a say in how my own sacrifices were treated. But as I stared at the paper, doubt crept in. Would taking the car back ruin whatever was left between me and Ethan? Would he see it as betrayal? Maybe, probably. But then I thought about all the small betrayals that had led us here, the refusals, the hesitations, the way Melissa looked at me like I was a potential spill waiting to happen. Love, I reminded myself, isn't supposed to make you feel unwelcome. I made a plan. Step 1. Wait for the right day. Both Ethan and Melissa had steady work schedules. Melissa left at 8 sharp, Ethan around 8:30. Wednesdays were best. Melissa had a meeting across town that kept her out until the afternoon, and Ethan's shift started later but ran longer. Step 2. Bring the title and ID to the dealership. Get an appraisal, negotiate, sign. I'd already rehearsed the conversation in my head. "It's in good condition, low mileage, clean history," I'd tell Mark, and he'd nod, knowing it was worth every bit of the price I was asking. Step 3. Return home without the car. Let Ethan call me. Let him ask where it went. Tell him the truth. The last part would be the hardest, not because I was afraid of the confrontation, but because I knew that hearing the hurt in his voice might make me want to backpedal. That's the thing about being a parent. You're wired to protect your child, even from consequences they've brought on themselves. But this time I couldn't protect him from the truth. That Sunday I tested my timing. I took the bus to their neighborhood and walked the block, pretending to be out for a stroll. At 8, Melissa's SUV pulled out of the drive, right on schedule. At 8:30, Ethan backed the silver sedan onto the street, waved to a neighbor, and drove off. I watched until the taillights disappeared. The car's empty space in the driveway felt like an invitation. That night I called Carl again. "I'm doing it Wednesday," I told him. "You sure?" he asked. "More sure than I've been about anything in a long time." "Then don't flinch," he said. "If you flinch, you'll regret it." I didn't sleep much the next 2 nights. Not because of nerves, but because my mind kept running over the plan, refining it. I even thought about what I'd wear, something neat but casual so I didn't look desperate when I walked into the dealership. My old baseball cap from the shop, a clean flannel, comfortable jeans. By Tuesday evening I had everything ready. Title and ID in my jacket pocket. A small folder with the maintenance records just in case. Even a thermos of coffee for the drive. It felt almost ceremonial. I stood at the window before bed, looking out at the street lamps casting their yellow pools of light on the asphalt. Tomorrow, the car would be mine again. And by tomorrow afternoon, it would belong to someone else entirely. I thought about what I'd do after. I imagined handing the donation to the Single Fathers Fund, picturing the look on the coordinator's face when she realized how much it was. I imagined the fathers who'd get help, gas money, grocery cards, maybe even car repairs, because of this. And for the first time in months, I felt something lift off my chest. This wasn't just about taking something back. It was about giving it forward. Wednesday morning came gray and cold, the kind of weather that feels like it's holding its breath. I was already up before the alarm. The title, my ID, and the maintenance records were neatly stacked in the manila envelope on the kitchen counter. My thermos of coffee sat beside it. I'd laid out my clothes the night before, flannel shirt, jeans, my old shop cap, so I wouldn't have to think about anything except the plan. At 7:30, I caught the first bus toward Ethan's neighborhood. The ride was quiet, just a few commuters staring at their phones, the hum of the engine filling the space between us. I kept my eyes on the window, watching the wet streets slide by. Every stop brought me closer, and with each mile, the weight in my chest got heavier, not from doubt, but from the knowledge that once I did this, there'd be no turning back. I got off 2 blocks away, walking the rest of the way like any neighbor out for an early stroll. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves. I kept my pace casual, hands in my jacket pockets, nodding at a dog walker who passed me without a second glance. At exactly 8, Melissa's SUV rolled out of the driveway, right on schedule. She didn't see me. A minute later, she turned the corner, gone from sight. I waited. At 8:30, the silver sedan came to life. Ethan backed it out slowly, waved to Mr. Franklin next door, and drove off in the opposite direction. The sound of the engine faded until there was only the quiet drip of rain from the trees. I stepped into the driveway. The car looked just as it had the day I'd bought it, gleaming, spotless. I pulled the spare key from my pocket. My hand hovered over the door handle for a second, not from hesitation, but from the strange realization that I'd never opened it without asking in months. The lock clicked. I slid into the driver's seat, the familiar smell of leather wrapping around me. For a second I just sat there, letting my hands rest on the steering wheel. It was strange. This was my car, legally mine, yet it felt like I was borrowing it. I started the engine. The purr was smooth, quiet. I backed out of the driveway, careful not to leave any tire marks, and turned toward the main road. With every block I put between me and their house, I felt a little lighter. The drive to the dealership took 20 minutes. I kept my eyes moving. Mirrors, intersections, the occasional glance at the sky as if it might start pouring at any second. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the side window. I didn't look like a man stealing something. I looked like a man finally claiming what was his. When I pulled into the dealership lot, Mark was already outside, smoking a cigarette under the awning. He spotted me and grinned. "Well, well, look what the wind blew in," he said, flicking the cigarette into the tray. "She's still a beauty." "She's still mine," I said, stepping out. We walked around the car together. Mark ran his fingers over the hood, checked the tread on the tires, peeked inside. "Low mileage, clean as a whistle," he said. "You've kept her in great shape." I didn't correct him. No need to explain the whole story. Inside, the appraisal didn't take long. Mark typed a few numbers into his computer, then turned the screen toward me. "Here's what I can offer you." It was fair, more than fair, actually. I nodded. "Let's do it." The paperwork was straightforward. I signed where Mark pointed, my hand steady. Each signature felt like closing a chapter, each initial like turning a lock. When it was done, he handed me a check. "You sure you're ready to part with her?" he asked. I looked out the window at the sedan still sitting in the lot. "I was ready the day I realized what she'd turned into," I said. Mark didn't ask what I meant. He just nodded, slid the check across the desk, and shook my hand. I didn't look back when I left the dealership. The car was theirs now, and in a few days it would belong to someone else entirely. That was fine. My part in its story was over. On the bus ride home, I pulled the check from my pocket and looked at the numbers. Enough to make a real difference for the single father's fund. Enough to turn something that had been a point of hurt into something that could help. I thought about Ethan. I knew he'd call as soon as he saw the empty driveway. I could already hear the shock in his voice, the questions, maybe even the anger, and I'd answer him honestly. It was my car, Ethan. I chose to use it for something that mattered. The rain had stopped by the time I reached my street. The clouds were breaking, sunlight spilling through in thin, gold lines. I took it as a sign. The action was done. The wait was gone. The call came just after 4 in the afternoon. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table, the check from the dealership resting in front of me, a cup of coffee cooling beside it. The house was quiet, too quiet. I knew that stillness wouldn't last. My phone buzzed, Ethan's name flashing across the screen. I picked it up. "Hey, son." His voice was tight, clipped. "Dad, where's the car?" No preamble, no hello, just the question. I took a breath. "It's not in the driveway, is it?" "Don't play games with me," he snapped. "I came home and it's gone. Melissa said you must have." He stopped, as if the words were hard to say. "Did you take it?" "I did," I said plainly. "It was in my name, Ethan. Legally, it was mine." There was a pause, filled only by the faint sound of his breathing. "Why would you do that? You gave it to me. You said it was mine." "I gave it to you to help you," I said. "To make your life easier. But somewhere along the way, that gift became something I wasn't welcome around. I wasn't allowed to sit in it without a towel. I wasn't trusted to borrow it in the rain." "That's not," he began, but I cut him off. "It is. The day I needed a ride to work and you said no because the seats were delicate. That wasn't about the car, Ethan. That was about me. About where I stand in your life." Silence again. I could picture him, jaw clenched, pacing the kitchen. Melissa probably hovering nearby. "So you just sold it," he said finally, disbelief in his voice. "Yes," I said. "I sold it this morning." "What did you even do with the money?" I looked down at the check, the ink still crisp. "I'm donating it to the Single Fathers Fund. They helped me when you were a baby and I was working 2 jobs to keep us afloat. I figured they could use it more than anyone." His voice rose. "So this was about making some kind of point?" "No," I said quietly. "It was about remembering that a gift should bring people closer, not push them apart. And when it stops doing that, when it becomes a wall, it's time to take it down." On the other end, I heard him let out a frustrated sigh. "You could have talked to me." "I tried," I said. "Not in words maybe, but in the way I kept reaching out. The way I asked for small things, rides, time together, and got excuses in return." "That's not fair," he said, "but there was less bite in it now." "Maybe not," I admitted, "but neither was the way I was treated. You might see it differently someday. Maybe not now, but someday." There was a long pause. I could hear faint murmuring Melissa's voice. Then Ethan came back on. "Melissa thinks this is petty." I let out a small laugh. I'm sure she does. She never saw me as part of that car story, just someone who might scratch the paint. That's not true, he said automatically, but his voice wavered. I'm not angry, Ethan, I said. I'm tired of feeling like my love comes with conditions. I wanted to do something good with what was left of it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, quieter now, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, I told him. Just think about it. Think about why I felt I had to do it. And think about whether the way we've been treating each other is the way we want to keep going. Another pause. Are you still coming over Sunday? If you want me to, I said. I'll let you know, he replied. When the call ended, I sat there a while, staring at the check again. I felt no rush of victory, no satisfaction, just a calm certainty that I'd done what I needed to do. The confrontation was over. The real question was what would come after. The next morning, I walked into the community center with the check tucked into my jacket pocket. The building smelled faintly of old wood and coffee, comforting in the way a familiar porch or a worn armchair is comforting. I'd been here before, decades ago, when I was a younger man with a baby on my hip and more bills than I could pay. Back then, the Single Fathers Fund had helped me with gas money so I could keep working both jobs. They'd slipped grocery cards into my hand when they knew I hadn't eaten more than a sandwich in 2 days. Now it was my turn. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a bun, looked up from her desk. Morning, can I help you? I'm here to see Linda, I said. She still runs the fund. She smiled. Been here longer than me. Let me get her. A few minutes later, Linda appeared in the doorway. She'd aged, haven't we all? But her eyes were still the same bright blue I remembered. John Miller, she said, her voice warm. I'd know that face anywhere. Good to see you, Linda, I said, shaking her hand. She led me to her small office where a corkboard covered in photos lined one wall, smiling dads with their kids, car seats in the back of old sedans, snapshots of Thanksgiving dinners and fishing trips. I recognized the look in those men's eyes. Gratitude mixed with exhaustion, determination tucked into a weary smile. So, Linda said, settling into her chair, what brings you in today? I pulled the check from my pocket and set it on her desk. I sold something. I want the money to go to the fund. She glanced at the numbers, then back at me, her eyebrows lifting. John, this is no small thing. It's the right thing, I said. You helped me when I needed it. I figure it's time to help someone else. Her eyes softened. Do you want to tell me the story? I hesitated, then told her. Not every detail, no need to drag Ethan and Melissa's names through the mud, but enough. The gift, the distance, the refusal, the decision to turn it into something that might matter again. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. You know, most people who come through here are hanging on by a thread. You've just given them a rope. We spent the next hour going through the paperwork, making sure the donation would be earmarked for emergency transportation needs. Car repairs, gas, even bus passes. You'd be surprised, Linda said, how many jobs are lost because someone's car broke down and they couldn't afford to fix it. I wasn't surprised at all. Before I left, Linda asked if I'd be willing to speak at the next community dinner. People should hear this, she said. Not just the money, but the heart behind it. I agreed, though public speaking had never been my favorite thing. This felt different. This wasn't about me. It was about what could come from letting go. That Saturday night, I stood in the community center gym, the smell of potluck casseroles and coffee drifting through the air. Folding tables lined the walls, and families, fathers and kids, mostly filled the room. Some I recognized from the photos in Linda's office. When she introduced me, I stepped up to the microphone, the low hum of conversation fading. I'm not much for speeches, I began, but I know what it's like to be where you are. I know what it's like to wake up wondering how you're going to make it through the week, to look at your kid and wonder if you can keep giving them what they need. I told them about the car, not as a tale of betrayal, but as a story about how sometimes gifts lose their shape, how they can turn into something they were never meant to be, and how, when that happens, you have a choice. Hold on until it breaks you or let go and give it a new purpose. This check, I said, holding it up, isn't about a car. It's about what the car was supposed to mean: freedom, dignity, connection. I hope it can bring that to someone here. When I stepped down, people clapped, not the polite kind, but the kind that says they've understood something. A young father came up to me afterward, his daughter balanced on his hip. "I'm starting a new job Monday," he said, "but my car needs a new alternator. Linda said your donation's going to cover it. I just wanted to say thank you." I shook his hand. "Make it count," I told him. Walking home later, the air cool against my face, I realized something. I didn't feel the loss of the car anymore. I didn't feel the sting of that rainy morning. What I felt was light, like I'd taken something heavy and set it down where it could be useful. For the first time in months, the gift was whole again. It was 3 days after the community dinner when Ethan called again. I was in the middle of fixing a neighbor's lawnmower when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Seeing his name on the screen gave me that strange mix of emotions, hope and apprehension, like opening a letter you're not sure you want to read. "Hey, Dad," he said when I answered. His voice was less sharp than the last time we'd spoken, but it carried a heaviness. "Hey, son," I replied. "How are you? I heard about the donation," he said after a pause. "Linda from the community center called to thank me for raising a man like you." I didn't know whether to laugh or let that one sink in. "I didn't expect her to do that," I said. "She also told me what the money's going to be used for," he continued. "Helping single dads fix their cars, get to work, stuff like that." "That was the idea," I said. Another pause. "Melissa thinks you should have told us first. She still does, but I think I understand why you didn't." I stayed quiet, letting him keep talking. "That night you called me out about the seats, I've been replaying it, and you're right. It wasn't about the car, it was about, I don't know. We just got so caught up in keeping it perfect that we forgot why you gave it to us in the first place." I let out a slow breath. It's not easy to see those things while you're in the middle of them. "Melissa's not ready to say she's sorry," he admitted. "But I am. I'm sorry, Dad, for making you feel like you weren't part of our lives, for treating you like a stranger in something you gave us." I felt something loosen in my chest. "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot." We talked for a while after that, about his work, about Melissa's latest project at her office, even about the weather. It wasn't a deep heart-to-heart, but it felt normal. And after months of strain, normal was a start. The following Sunday, Ethan invited me over for dinner. When I arrived, the silver sedan space in the driveway was empty. They'd bought a different car, smaller, used, with a couple of scratches on the bumper. Melissa greeted me at the door, her smile a little stiff, but she didn't avoid my eyes. "We made pot roast," Ethan said. "Figured you'd like that." We sat at the table, the conversation polite but steady. Melissa didn't bring up the car, and I didn't either. Instead, we talked about my work at the shop, the community center, and a fishing trip Ethan was planning with some friends. At one point, Melissa excused herself to get dessert. While she was in the kitchen, Ethan leaned in slightly. "She'll come around," he said quietly. "Just give her time." "I'm not in a rush," I told him. After dinner, as I was leaving, Melissa handed me a container of leftovers. "Thanks for coming," she said. Her tone was soft, almost tentative. On the walk home, I thought about how small gestures can sometimes be the first cracks in a wall. No big apologies, no sweeping reconciliations, just a shared meal, a container of food, a conversation without sharp edges. It wasn't the closeness we'd had once, but it was a step towards something better. And for now, that was enough. It's been a month since I sold the silver sedan. In that time, life has taken on a quieter rhythm. The check is gone now, converted into alternators, bus passes, and gas money for fathers who needed a hand. I've gotten a few thank you cards in the mail, each one written in a different style but carrying the same message. "You made it possible for me to keep going." Every time I read those words, I think about the way we measure the value of a gift. For a long time, I thought it was in the giving itself, how much it cost, how much effort it took. But I've learned it's not just that. A gift's value is in the life it lives after you give it away. The car's life with Ethan and Melissa wasn't what I imagined. I pictured shared rides, road trips, the kind of small errands that turn into stories you tell years later. Instead, It became a wedge between us. But once it left their driveway for the last time, it found a new purpose, one that reached further than I ever could have planned. Ethan and I talk more now, not every day but enough. Melissa still keeps her distance, though she's warmer than before. I don't push. Relationships, I've learned, don't heal on command. They mend in their own time if you give them the space and care they need. Sometimes I walk past their street and see their new car in the driveway, smaller, a little beat up, but clearly lived in. I hope they take trips in it, spill coffee in it, fill it with groceries and beach sand and all the little messes that mean it's being used for life, not just for show. As for me, I've stopped thinking of the car as a loss. It's not mine anymore in any sense. What I carry instead is the memory of standing in that community center, handing over a check that would ripple out into dozens of small but important changes. That's the picture I keep in my mind, not the rainy morning when I was told I couldn't borrow it. If you've been listening to my story all this way, maybe you've thought about a gift you've given, or one you've received, that didn't go the way you hoped. Maybe it was misunderstood or misused, or maybe it just didn't land where your heart thought it would. Here's what I've learned. A gift doesn't stop being yours to guide just because it's left your hands. You can still choose to redirect it, to find it a new home, to make sure it does the work you meant it to do. And if that means letting go, then letting go can be its own kind of generosity. I'm not telling you this to pat myself on the back. I'm telling you because I know how easy it is to feel stuck in hurt, stuck in resentment, stuck in the gap between what you gave and what you got back. You don't have to stay there. You can take that hurt and turn it into something else, something good. That's what I did. And I'll tell you, it feels a lot lighter to carry. So thank you for sitting with me through this story, for giving me your time and your ears. Maybe you've seen a bit of your own life in mine. Maybe you're thinking about what you might do differently next time. I hope you remember this. Giving is powerful, but giving with respect, both ways, is what makes it last. I wish you health. I wish you a place to belong. I wish you people who see you for all that you are and all that you've done. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other.